Welcome again to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. We're going to be continuing on today from the program we started last time on psychiatry. Are you out of your mind? And I'm hoping that you are going to find this enjoyable and informative and will provoke you to look on your own. I'm not really trying to convince you because these are my opinions based on about 40 years of clinical experience and research. However, we want you to look into it. My comments and my opinions are presented to provoke your thinking so that you can look into it on your own and come to your own conclusion. This is a free country, or at least reasonably so. And we want you to make your own decisions. We want to look into all this material. I present material, and don't stop at mine. Go on the internet, go to the bookstores, dig wherever you can, talk to a lot of people, and come to your own conclusions. I've had a lot of background in psychiatry. I've done a lot of psychotherapy with patients, and basically with some very good results over the years. And so I'm reasonably confident that I may not be 90 or 100%, but maybe 99.9% accurate in terms of what I present. But as I say, it's my presentation, my conclusions. And the thing for you to do is to take references, material, people that have high-level credentials in the field, and look into it and come up with your own feeling about how it might be usable for you. Now, as I had said before, I think if you are considering going to a psychiatrist, you might need to have your head examined, which is meant to be humorous, but to bring up a point. Having watched the progression of psychiatry over the many, many years, and the results that have occurred as a result of modern psychiatry, I've been very unhappy with the direction it took. Now, we're going to review just a little bit to kind of refresh it in your mind, but you'll recall that we talked, first of all, about the fact that many, many years ago, when someone had a emotional mental problem, probably became psychotic or had a big breakdown of some sort, it was considered brain fever and incurable, and the way to treat that was to put someone and lock them in a dungeon and shove them in some food and water and leave them away from harming anyone else or passing it on to anyone else. And of course the fate was you stayed there till you died. Now Freud came along, and he began to think there's a lot more to it, and so I consider him one of the geniuses of modern psychiatry, in as much as he took the people out of the dungeons and really recognized there were some things going on in the mind that could be dealt with, could be changed, could be understood, and that he could give some explanations of why people might have the behavior they had and be unable to function either emotionally or mentally. And as a result of that, we find that there was a big forward step taken that gave us a better understanding. Now, that's not to say that everything Freud said was 100% accurate, but it sure opened the door for people to start looking for some reason other than brain fever why the people had the problems they had and behaved the way they did. Now, out of his work ultimately grew a branch of psychiatry known as the psychoanalytic or dynamic approach. That meant that, as you probably recall, I mentioned that he said that the mind had three levels or divisions, if you want to call it that. The id, which was the basic unconscious primitive drives. He put a lot of sexual connection with that. And he said those are the things that push us from underneath in a lot of different directions. He also said that we have the conscious mind, the one that we operate from every day. And that one is the one where we can apply some logic and reason, and we can take in information and we can in some way deal with it. And the third, of course, he said was the superego, which was the programmed part of us that had to do with our conscience. And therefore, many times when we did things that violated that conscience, it caused us to feel guilty and could lead us to a lot of problems. So that was his structure or division of the mind. And it reminded me that later something called transactional analysis came along, developed by a psychiatrist by the name of Eric Berne. And he talked about ego states, and the ego states he referred to were the child ego state, which in some respects might have some relationship to the id that Freud talked about, and the normal conscious state, which could be maybe related to the adult ego state, where we take in information and we somehow deal with that information, apply logic to it, and so forth. Not so emotional, more fact gathering and logical dealing with information. And he referred to the parent ego state, which can have some correlation to the superego, or this the conscience that people have. And basically these would be things that would be programmed into us by our parents, and all of these you shoulds, you must, you ought, and you never, and so forth, all of those programs that ruled us when we were young to control the behavior of the id or the child ego state. Now, I know those are only rough generalizations, but in my working with transactional analysis, which I did for many years and still do to an occasion, it was a good structure to kind of put a handle on the different parts of us that are influencing us in the way we behave. So I think that Freud did open big doors, and he kind of got things going. Ultimately, he, after working with hypnosis and various things, had some of his own issues, and one was he had trouble looking people in the eye. Now, some psychiatrists, especially psychoanalytic psychiatrists, might be a bit put out by what I said, but there was evidence that he had his own neuroses, and so he chose to have people lie on a couch and him sit off to the side and talk and kind of let that person delve into their thoughts, feelings, and so forth. And of course, the ultimate thinking about that was, now that I'm talking about later where psychoanalysis went, they began to think if you could just bring up into your conscious mind memories of all these things that transpired when you were young, and then that knowledge would be enough to free you. Of course, as it ended up, that didn't happen quite that way, and I'm not saying there's not exceptions. As you're going to find in everything, there's rarely a clear-cut line down that says everything here is this way and everything here is that way. You kind of got this gray area where, yeah, this is generally true, but in some cases, with some people, it doesn't go that way. And so that, of course, is always the confusing thing about research. That's always the confusing thing about analyzing, the confusing thing about diagnosing. Rarely are the lines clear-cut. And even with giving medications, not that I'm saying I'm big on it, but the giving of medications tells us that usually you have some people that can be unaffected by a medication at all, no matter what the dose, unless you get it to the lethal dose that it might kill them. Other people are going to be somewhat affected, but very minimally. Then another group being kind of the middle group, we're going to get the effect, or at least some degree of the effect that the medication was designed for. Then you're going to get some people that it profoundly affects them. It takes very little of it to have an effect. Then you're going to have some that it makes very sick and produces some big health problems. And then on that other extreme end, from the one on the other far end, that nothing happens, this person, it can become fatal for in minimal doses. And so it's that spectrum of things that we're dealing with all the time, that it's not quite as simple and as clear-cut as we would like it to be. Now, I'm saying that Freud kind of opened the door, and out of what he opened began what was called the dynamic concept of mental problems, and therefore it was, I say, felt that if you could bring that to your conscious mind, that would help get rid of it. And in a few cases that can be true, but not all cases. So it isn't a clear-cut model that's going to really solve everybody's problem. There are people that go through years of psychoanalysis and literally today's world, $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 of fees, and still walk away and saying, well, I do this because this happened, however I still do it. If you want to read an example of that, there's a performer by the name of Orson Dean that many years was exposed to an unusual therapy, the work of Wilhelm Reich, and what was at that time called orgone therapy and later has become known as bioenergetic therapy. Anyhow, after Orson Dean had spent 2 years or 3 years of psychoanalysis and a lot of money, he knew something about the cause of some of his problems, but he still had them. And so he went to a different type of therapy, which kind of a mixture of analytic, but the analysis side of it was not what was important. It was breaking the defenses and letting it dissipate. That was the real clincher as far as having improvement. So Orson Dean went to a therapist in New York by the name of Dr. Ellsworth Baker. He wrote a textbook on it called Man in the Trap, based on the work of Wilhelm Reich, because he studied directly with him. And anyhow, in a short period of time, he broke through all this stuff and was freed of it. And so he became very excited and wrote the book called Me and the Orgone. So if you can find the book by Orson Dean, it was many years ago, and read his account, you understand what I'm talking about. If not, probably at some point we'll get into Reichian therapy, but it's rarely called that anymore. Very few people call it orgone, which was Reich's term for organic energy. And he said that we all have this living organic energy in us, and that it must flow freely for us to be healthy, and if it gets blocked by emotions, it can cause us not only to not function well, but it at the same time can lead to physical problems because the muscle groups in our body become locked up or blocked or armored. He used the term armor, and therefore become a part of our defensive mechanism. And until we can break these physical bands, of which he said there were 7, then you're really going to not only have emotional problems, you're going to have physical problems. So anyhow, it worked very well for Orson Dean. In a short time, he went through all this stuff that took him years of psychoanalytic work, which did not correct. So that kind of gives you an idea that, as I say, everything isn't so simple and clear-cut as it might be. Now, you're probably going to find little on orgone therapy today. You may find some. But as it went on, some of the other doctors, such as Alexander Lowen, John Pierakis, and so forth, that studied with Dr. Reich, changed the terminology. They didn't like the word orgone. People couldn't relate to that too well, and so they called it bioenergetics or bioenergetic therapy. And so if you look more under bioenergetic therapy, you'll probably find more information, although there is an Orgone Institute that still makes available the writings of Wilhelm Reich, so you at least could find some of the old stuff under that. I'm not sure about the book. It's probably out of print, called Man in a Trap. But it's a good book. The doctor's name was Ellsworth Baker, as I mentioned. But you probably can pretty easily find something called Bioenergetics by Alexander Lowen, who is also studied, as I say, under Reich. So I'm just trying to give you some background. I'm a student always of not only current practice of medicine, whether natural or otherwise, but I'm also a student of medical history, whether it be psychiatry or just physical medicine or whatever. I like to know, how did we get to where we are today? So I've spent a lot of time over the years digging into the history, and I think gives you a much better understanding, gives you information that makes it more reasonable how we got to thinking how we are today. And it is sometimes interesting. And then sometimes we have something called a paradigm shift, where suddenly a new breakthrough occurs and a whole new way of thinking occurs. And a lot of things change when those happen. At some point, we'll probably talk about paradigm shifts. But you will find that those are those momentous times when suddenly there's a whole new revelation about some particular subject. Whether it be scientific, medical, or whatever, when you have a paradigm shift, suddenly people see things in a different way than they did before, usually a much fuller way. Not saying that it can't go negatively and go to the opposite, but generally speaking, it's going to go forward and it's going to expand. I sometimes, when talking with people, say, my history of learning has been such that over the years, every time I began to feel like I knew a little, I would open a new door and find that I'm just starting over. Not that simple. So I've gone through many of these steps along the years in learning, and I expect I'll continue so as long as I'm still trucking about on this earth. I'm going to be learning, because there is no end. And as you find out now that more historical things have been uncovered, and then you find out, well, gee, we're kind of ignorant today compared to what's been known in time before. And then I spend a lot of time delving. A lot of stuff has been uncovered in recent years. And when I say recent, and probably about the last 50 years or so, there's been a sudden uncovering of all kinds of information that goes back for thousands of years that adds some knowledge base to what we thought we know now. And I found out that thousands of years ago they knew about DNA, and they knew the effect of it. They knew how to change DNA and play with it and try to develop new things. We consider the discovery in the 50s by Watson and Crick, the structure of DNA, we consider that to be a big breakthrough. But these people know about it thousands of years ago, so nothing is ever so clear-cut, and I'm not so sure that we're not spending more time relearning what was already known than we are making big breakthroughs. It's only very seldom that somebody comes along and does that. Now, that's my little editorial that I'm throwing in, because it served me well over the years, and it's opened my eyes over and over and over. I came from a little town in West Virginia. They didn't have a public library. I became very intrigued with understanding why and how things happen. The material was not available. I considered one of the happy days of my life when I found out we were going to be moving out of that little town up into northern Ohio near Cleveland into a whole new world. I was excited about it. My mother, dad, and sister. My dad never really got over it because all of his family, all of his life had been there. And going out into the big city and be exposed to all this stuff was quite new to him. And I don't think he ever did it just really well. My mother and sister cried almost every day for a year after they left because all their friends, relatives, and pretty much everything they knew were back there. And I guess I was the pioneer in the family. I wanted to get out in the world. I wanted to see how it worked. And I knew that had I stayed there, my opportunities were very limited because there was nothing nearby. Now, eventually, I guess, had I traveled out of that city, but you have to understand in some of those areas in West Virginia that I came from, and Kentucky and some of the other states, Tennessee, there's areas where probably in a whole lifetime people don't venture more than 10, 20, 30 miles away from their house. And they really have a very limited view of the world, and I'm not saying that is a critique. That's their lifestyle, and they're perfectly free to do it, but it didn't serve me very well. So it led me to get out and find out what was going in the world, and I've never stopped since then. I guess I hit the road with wheels spinning, and they've continued to spin from as long as I could find out. Now, I really exhausted there everything that I could. By the time I was in 7th grade, I think I pretty well was knowledgeable of everything there was to learn there. In school, when I had opportunity, I went to the library and spent time there because we had no books at home. My parents were not readers. Since there was no library, it really wouldn't have made any difference because I had no way to get to the library anyhow. But if there had been a library, I probably would have tried in some way to have access. So my early learning was whatever I could pick up from other people, books they were throwing away, material that one of my uncles studied electronics, and he had a lot of study material for that. He gave it to me. I studied chemistry, physics, whatever I could get information on, psychology. And so I'm not saying that to brag on myself. I'm only saying that it seems that I started out in the world with a thirst to understand how things work, and I've continued it over these years. At one point, I have had in my library, I know I estimated the total books in around 25,000 books. And not every one of those are books you sit down and read through. Many are reference books, but the ones that were readable, I probably have read pretty much all of those. And there have been periods of time when I've added probably 10 to 30 books per month to my library because I'm wanting to know how all this stuff works. Okay, enough of the editorial side. Behaviorism. After Freud, there were some people, or sometimes concurrent with, that got into understanding behavior from the behavioral side, and they began to think that the body is basically a lot of free reflexes. Forget about what the reason is. Why did it happen? If you're not functioning well, we'll just alter your behavior. So Pavlov and his salivating dogs, which I mentioned. Skinner later was the operant therapy person. It was kind of got down to two things. You could either just condition somebody, either by rewards. Mostly it was actually aversive. But it's sometimes association. You could associate one behavior with another, and eventually you could model behavior with that. That was Pavlov's work. Skinner developed ways of modifying behavior. You punish somebody with an electric shock when they behave the way you don't want them to. Or the immersion therapy, where you just, if somebody's afraid of snakes, you throw the snake in their lap and they either die or they get over it. So anyhow, those are some of the things that came along. But I'd say that Skinner's was the most sophisticated. He said, you don't want to do all that stuff to people. You don't want to punish them. You don't want to hurt them. You just want to change their behavior. So what you do is you wait till they're doing something that you want, and then you reward the behavior you like. And so that was called operant conditioning. That came from Skinner. Then I told you that later that there were some doctors that reinforced that with hypnosis to make it work faster, and so they did systematic desensitization, and all these different things came along for behavior. So the analytical people said you have to understand why the person's doing it, or you're never going to get them better. The behaviorist says, I don't really care why they're there. Let's just change the behavior and everything will be fine. So anyhow, those were the two big schools, and everything else kind of went toward one way or the other until the big pharma stepped in. And they began to realize that, well, here are these drugs that can block things, or they can overstimulate things. And so we can just mold the behavior by blocking things in the brain or overstimulating things in the brain. And of course, that always has to pay a price. You have to pay something for that. When you start putting a chemical into the brain that takes control of the brain in one way or the other, either by shutting down or overstimulating, you now are fussing and messing with brain chemistry, which is not that simple to understand and control. I did mention last time that one of the major drug companies that made LSD later manufactured Prozac. I guess they did a lot of study about depression and so forth, and they realized that LSD puts you on this big high. And so they decided, well, of course, it was declared illegal by the government because there were some major ramifications with that. You know, like people jumping out of buildings and trying to fly and doing all kinds of strange things. And they said, yeah, maybe we better not do that. Now, there were some doctors, some psychiatrists, like such as Stanislav Grof and so forth, who worked with LSD in the early days, and they were thinking it maybe had a lot of therapeutic capabilities in helping people expand their capabilities and getting out of some of the things that they were doing. However, there were some bad things that happened with it, to the point that they had to decide, well, I don't think we should, that's not a drug that should be out there and being prescribed to people. It has a lot of implications. A few micrograms of that can alter the whole brain chemistry. Now, we were talking about messing with things like serotonin, basically, because that's what LSD did. It got into the brain, it attached to the serotonin receptor sites and overstimulated them like crazy, and so the person went way up in the air, and they called it a mood elevator, mood brightener. They couldn't stay depressed, but they could have a bad trip, because sometimes it uncapped some things out of the unconscious that were very scary, and they got amplified because of the heavy load of serotonin, and so they were doing some strange things. So anyhow, the big theory of all the great things you might be able to do with the LSD ended up, no, not so good. The adverse things way outweigh what benefits we're probably going to get from it. So anyhow, I think in those studies, the same pharmaceutical looked for other ways to do it the same way, but maybe not quite as powerful, so they came up with the Prozac. Now, there's a big story behind Prozac, and you know, I don't even have to tell you all this stuff. I want you to read it. Now, I mentioned before the books that I thought were very powerful, but one of the biggest ones that I think are useful is Peter Breggin, Dr. Peter Breggin. It's going to be on our list that we'll have posted on our site. He wrote a book many years ago called Toxic Psychiatry. And he was saying way back, you know, you can't use drugs. If you're going to get people well, you've got to love them, you've got to do psychotherapy with them, you've got to help them make changes in their life. And just trying to manage an emotion with drug is not really solving the problem. Now, I know a lot of people have praised Prozac and said, wow, you know, I feel the best I've felt in years and blah, blah, blah. And that's true, and I'm guessing if you're going to let people who are on the drug, which is sometimes referred to as a mood brightener, if their comments are going to determine whether you should use it or not, you could have done that with LSD. I don't know hardly anybody that was on LSD, and especially when they were on one of the LSD trips, that it would have ever said, oh, this stuff is awful, no one should have it. They all were looking forward to more of it. But it wasn't solving anything, and as I say, many times it let skeletons out of the closet that were destructive to the people who took it. Now, you would think, well, but that's not the case with Prozac. Well, I think if you read Breggin's book, and one of his other books after that, which I have, called Talking Back to Prozac, what doctors are telling you about today's most controversial drug. Anyhow, he wrote that in response to a book that somebody put out. I don't know if they were paid by the drug companies or what it was. I really can't say. But I do know it was trying to advocate a lot of people get on Prozac, and it was called Listening to Prozac. And the theme of it was, well, you know, pretty much almost everybody maybe ought to get onto some Prozac, because it really makes you feel up in the air and happy, and you could just go out and do all kind of things. However, they weren't telling you the whole story. Peter Breggin was involved with some lawsuits against the manufacturer, and in the process, it ended up that they uncovered some material from the pharmaceutical that was withheld from the FDA, something to do with if you're on it too long, and then either it's not working anymore, because remember that the receptor sites in the brain, the serotonin receptor sites, if they get too much overstimulation, they downregulate. They're saying, wait a minute, that's too much. And so they downregulate, which means they lose their sensitivity to the serotonin. Now that means that the drug, based on building up more serotonin in the synaptic cleft, has overstimulated to the point the body's saying, stop, stop, too much. And it shuts down. Turn off the switch. Those receptors aren't going to be sensitive to serotonin anymore. Now, what's that going to do? Well, number one, it's going to mean that probably the Prozac isn't going to work very well until you finally ruin all the rest of the receptor sites. Then, of course, there's a total collapse. But in some people who are highly sensitive, it could shut it down pretty fast. And when that happens, they either could commit suicide or go kill someone. And those were some of the things that they didn't want to get out to people know about. So you really need to read his book, Talking Back to Prozac, if you want to get some more of the lowdown of what he's saying, that what they're not telling you. And so when you mess with brain chemistry by putting in powerful drugs that alter it, I think you're doing a disservice to people. I understand it's a terrible problem to be depressed, and I think that there are, however, ways to get out of that if you understand the brain and the mind and how they work that are not going to create further problems. Somebody's been doing some digging in a lot of these mass shootings, and I can't say for a fact in every case, but it's sure seeming like a lot of people have been on either Prozac or one of the similar drugs before all this happened. And it can drive you berserk by overstimulating the certain receptor sites, serotonin. So it's just not so good to do that. So it bothered me when I studied psychiatry and I saw the shift coming, which is, I said, at a certain point, we got away from psychotherapy. We got away from saying these problems are emotional, mental problems, and saying, well, it's all chemistry, and the transmitters are not working right, so we just got to put these drugs in to manage it. Now, they didn't say they were correcting anything. You have to remember, if you look carefully at pretty much every drug that's on the market today, and I'm not talking just psychiatric, I'm talking about medication in general, it was never created to cure anything. That's not the purpose. If you read The Lancet, which is the most prestigious medical journal in the world, or the New England Journal of Medicine, or the Journal of the American Medical Association, all of the research articles that are published in there that have to do with medications, they're not saying, oh, this is to cure this. What they're saying is, this is to manage the symptoms of. Manage the symptoms. Now, what does managing the symptoms means? It means in some way you're interfering with body chemistry, whether biochemistry in general, or whether psycho and chemistry in the brain. You're altering it in some way to either turn something off or overstimulate something. Bottom line. So Prozac is an overstimulator of the serotonin receptor sites. That is what lifts your mood. There's a whole lot of other ways to do that. Dr. Bregan talks about it, and there's other people. And I mentioned the other book last time that should be one of the hallmark books you read. It's called Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, and that's going to be on the list. And he talks about all these different drugs. He calls them magic bullets, psychiatric drugs, and the astonishing rise of mental illness in America. Now, if we're helping people get well, why would it be increasing? So to me, it raises a lot of questions. Now, there was another book that I had in my library, came out quite some time ago, called Turning the 90s Upside Down, Prozac, Panacea or Pandora. Now, there's some very interesting stories in both the book by Whitaker and this book about the effects of some of these drugs that we're talking about. And I think it would behoove you to read those. Now, I hope you could still get this one. Her name was Anne Blake Tracy that wrote this. But you remember the story Pandora, of course, when it was taught to me in very early school. I don't even know if they teach it anymore, but this girl was warned about this interesting box she found, and it was actually wrapped and locked shut as though stay out. And she decided she was going to look in there to see what was in there. And of course she was warned, don't do it, Pandora, because you're going to open a whole lot of problems if you do that. Well, anyhow, her curiosity got the best of her. She opened the box, and all the troubles of the world came out of the box, and therefore we've had all these troubles in the world ever since. And so it's always referred to as a Pandora's box, you know, like, oh, if you do this, you're going to open a Pandora's box. And so the lady chose that as part of the title. But for some reason, people got the feeling that if they take some of these drugs, wow, everything is going to be great, you know. It's like I haven't put on my rose-colored glasses for a while, but you put on your rose-colored glasses, and wow, everything is going to be great. However, that's not true, and I'm saying, wake up. These things are not so good for you, and don't buy all of the commercials that we see on TV that you see this person with the background with no color, it's very dull at the most, and this person's no smile, their head's down, everyone around them, their head's down, no smiles. Then you take the drug and suddenly you're out in the sunshine, everything is bright, everybody's got a big smile on their face and everything is wonderful. Talk about an overdose of rose-colored glasses, it is. That's not true, and I think that it behooves you to go, especially if you're either wanting to or know somebody that you care for, considering getting on some of these drugs. They're not that simple. It's just like years ago, we had a lot of anxiety. People were developing a lot of stress. So they came out with something called Valium, which is part of a family of drugs called benzodiazepines, who work to enhance the GABA circuits in the brain, which are the opposing circuits to the dopa circuits, which rev things up. The dopa shuts things down. So what happened is that that benzodiazepines enhanced the GABA effect to shut things down. For the people who are too anxious, it made them more relaxed. Now, what they said was, no problem taking these, but the fact is those are some of the most addictive drugs out there, because once you do that, you again down-regulate some of your own natural things in the brain related to GABA circuits, and guess what happens? Now, every time you try to quit taking them, the anxiety gets overwhelming. If you were taking them to sleep, because that's one of the reasons they've given them, one of the forms called Ativan to cause you to sleep, you try to get off of it, you'll stay awake for days, 24 hours a day. You can't sleep because it's so addictive. So it's not that simple. You know, when you take a drug that substitutes for something else in the body, and you do that for a while, when you suddenly withdraw that, you don't realize that the body has altered a lot of things to compensate for the stimulation from that drug. And when you pull it away, all of a sudden it's gone. And so the body's saying, hey, what's going on? Help me. And they feel like they're going to go crazy. So, and that's true of cocaine because and the opiates, because the body produces natural opiates to take care of certain things that we can utilize without being addicted. And when we take those away, the external ones, the body has shut down, making it on its own. And so guess what happens? You now are having a reaction, a withdrawal. And that's even true of simpler things like caffeine. When we take caffeine, that helps to do certain things in the body, but when you quit drinking caffeine, what happens? You get a headache, you get all these things suddenly come on because you've withdrawn a stimulant of some sort, and now the body is having to redo things. And the same is true with nicotine. And that's why it's hard to get off of nicotine, is because you actually have receptor sites that in the pharmacological field are called nicotinic receptor sites. And why do they call them that? Is because if you put nicotine in the body, those sites grab onto these molecules, actually prefer them because they give more stimulation to the receptor sites. Okay, so now one day, since you're providing it from outside, the body doesn't have to provide it, so it downregulates the production. And so now you have to have the nicotine every day to stimulate, otherwise you go. And so then when you try to withdraw, it's not a simple matter, because now you don't have either one. Now, there are some ways of doing that, and we're going to be doing a later session about all of the psychological, psychiatric type things, of some things you can do either on your own or that can be done that are outside the drug thing. Now, you realize that pharmacology after World War II, started to realize they could make molecules synthetically, and they could patent them, and therefore they could charge whatever they wanted for them, and it could become a big business. So the pharmaceutical industry just blossomed because of all this. And so after that, they were then looking for, okay, what market can we get into that we can make a drug and get people to buy it and make a lot of money from it. So like all the other markets, they jumped into the psychological side. You know, LSD showed them that you can really do something to the brain with certain chemicals that the brain says, wow, and puts you way up in the air, and the people like that. And there's a lot of other drugs that do the same thing. Some still are illegal. In fact, they all now are down under what are called Schedule I drugs, which is called a controlled substance that's highly addictive and possibly destructive and has no known medical uses. So that's that whole Schedule I group of drugs that doctors can't even prescribe it. You can only get it in a research institution in limited quantities, and you have to prove that you've got a project that would benefit something from that if you were to utilize it in that project. And so you can't even give those to people, period. But at any rate, the pharmaceuticals realized there was a big market out there, and so they started jumping on the bandwagon. And they came up with all these drugs. Now, my feeling is, of course, that they developed what I called a modus operandi. You know, you're always talking about a crime. There's a modus operandi or an MO. You always hear in some of these police and detective stories on TV, they're always talking about the MO, the modus operandi, which means the method of operation. And so consequently, in this process of trying to find more markets for some more substances to make more money, they got into the psychiatric field, and it just happened that when I was first studying it, it was during that time that this transition was starting and continued to develop. And so the way they do it is, okay, they had LSD and that was wiped out. They thought they were going to make a lot of money on it, but it was wiped out. They couldn't do it, so they were continuing to research what can put the person on a high. Okay, well, we can't give this molecule that directly connects to the serotonin receptor sites and overstimulates them and takes them on this really big trip. So how can we get a similar effect? So they came up with a drug that ended up being called Prozac. Same company, but this one works a little different. It blocks the reuptake and breakdown, or breakdown. Mostly the reuptake is what they block of these transmitters, because when your body releases a neurotransmitter, it travels across the synaptic cleft and attaches to a receptor site designed to receive that on the next neuron and therefore sends a message. Okay, well, as soon as that has happened, the receptor site spits it out. It's almost like taking a cherry, taking the meat off the cherry and spitting out the pit. It's not quite like that, but that's the idea. Okay, the receptor site's gotten the message, it's done with it, forget it. So it goes out and is either broken down by an enzyme that tears it all apart, or it's sucked back up into the neuron that produced it and recycled and put out again. So that's called a reuptake. Now, what the Prozac does is it blocks it being reuptaken, therefore forces a buildup of too much serotonin in the cleft. So then you've got more serotonin that just keeps stimulating the receptor sites to the point that they're overstimulated. That's when the problem begins, because then the neurons say, now wait a minute, stop. It's almost like you had 15 or 20 pitchers throwing balls at you, and you're trying to hit them back, and you finally say, hey, stop. And you're going to be overstimulated, so what do? You're going to throw your bat down and walk away. Forget it. And so that's what the receptor sites do. They just shut down and say no more. Now, once that happens, now your plight is starting to get worse than it was originally, because before, you may or may not have low serotonin, or it could have been other factors. See, they're just assuming that that's what it is. But in any case, they just keep pelting all these receptor sites with these molecules until you're saying, wow, I feel pretty good. Whee! Let's go out and party, or whatever it is. because I feel up in the air. This is great, But then you pay a price for that because you're artificially doing something in the circuitry of the brain that it does not like. After a while it says, that's it, stop, whoa, hold it, that's no more, too much. And so that's when the problems began. So when you read Bregan's material, you'll begin to see what these happen. Now there's some other stories I could tell you about this, but at this point we don't have time to get into it, except what I do want to tell you is that out of all of this stuff, not just the psychiatric, but all the medications, the pharmaceutical companies realized that they could create a market. What they did is, they knew that people were going to like this idea of being up in the air, and they couldn't use LSD, so let's make this Prozac. So what they do, they develop a molecule that they find out will have certain effects in the human system, whether in the brain or whether in the rest of the body, wherever it is. There's a system that this molecule is going to affect. So now they have something to market. But you have to have people need it. So then what you have to do, the second step that they were very good at, and still are, is you have to go out and create a problem. What's the problem? Oh, it's terrible. Look at all these people that are depressed. It's terrible. We've got to do something about it. And so there's a lot of PR that goes on in advance after they have this molecule that gets people tuned in and says, wow, that's right. I didn't realize it, but I think I do have some depression. Because they get this nice ads, used to be in the magazine, more and more now to TV, radio, whatever, but TV is the best. It's the hottest media. It affects you in every part of the sensory input. And so you show this, and you show these people down, and they take this drug, and now everybody's happy. The sunshine's gotten brighter. Everybody's smiling. So you just wipe those frowns right off the face with a dose of this drug. And so what they did was they first of all created the drug, the molecule. Then they get a problem. Well, there's a lot of depressed people out there. Here's the symptoms of depression. You should be thinking about the fact you might be depressed. Maybe you should go see your doctor or have him refer you to a psychiatrist or whatever. So, you start with getting this problem out there. Now, once a lot of people are saying, yeah, boy, that's right, I think I do have some depression, but what am I going to do about it? We have the answer. And then comes the big campaign. If you are down and you can't function and everybody around you is not happy because you're not happy, take this drug and then everybody will be smiling. We have the answer. And then once you have the people's attention and they start buying the drug, then you market it like crazy. And that's the modus operandi of every drug that comes out. You start out by creating it. Now, I mentioned before about cholesterol. They started talking about the fact, well, there's some preliminary studies that indicate it could be possible that maybe there might be some relationship between the level of cholesterol and plaquing in your arteries. Well, that never came about. That never was true. It still isn't true today. And if you go back and look at my broadcast on cholesterol, you'll find that it was a big hoax. But the people bought the fact that, cholesterol being up could be a big problem. And could affect my health, could give me a heart attack, could plug up my arteries. Oh, it's terrible. Now, what are we going to do about it? We have a solution. We have this drug that's going to go in there and it's going to push that cholesterol down. Of course, now don't pay any attention to the fact it's going to destroy your liver because it's going to be damaging liver cells, trying to force them not to produce cholesterol, because when your body is under stress, it needs more cholesterol to make repairs in your body, and therefore the signal goes to the liver to pump out more cholesterol. But, don't pay attention to that. I think so many times in the drug industry of the Wizard of Oz, when the old man who is proposing to be the wizard is behind this curtain, operating all these dials, and up on the screen is this big terrible face and fire and all kinds of stuff, and the people are awed at it. And Toto runs over and pulls back the curtain. And he turns around and notices that the people see that he's there. And so what does he say through the big face up on the screen? Pay no attention to the old man behind the curtain. Just see what I'm telling you. And so basically, if we're not there, we're pretty close to that in the way things are done today. So anyhow, that's where psychiatry got to. Create the need, offer the solution, and then market it like crazy. But you first have to find them. You have to find these molecules. So they have research departments going all the time, studying all these different molecules and seeing what they do. And once they find one that's pretty powerful in doing something, you've got to create a market for it, and that's what they do. Now, as I said in my cholesterol one, the cholesterol was never a problem. It's a natural body product that's needed. The more stressed you are, the more of it you need to make repairs because your body's being damaged when you're under stress. And therefore, if you shut down the cholesterol production, guess what you're doing? You're impairing the body's ability to repair itself, and in the long run, you're doing more damage, plus the fact you can damage the liver from forcing it not to make it. So I hope all this is beginning to make sense. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm trying to awaken you and get you thinking, and don't be duped by all the advertising that's out there. I don't care what it is. It could even be natural products. Don't be duped with the advertising. There's nothing that's a panacea that cures everything. I don't care what anybody says. It just doesn't happen. Everybody's unique, and certain things affect certain people in certain ways, and other things don't. Some things will poison one person and it won't have any effect on another person. And there's reasons for that which we don't have time to get into now. I think I've kind of alluded to it before. Something called SNPs, and probably one of these days we'll get into that. There's never enough time. But anyhow, now what we've gotten to, we've got all these people being destroyed. And actually, people are starting to think you can't live without these drugs. I don't know how people I've talked to and said, well, my doctor says I have to take this or I'll die. And here they're taking a drug that's killing him, and he's saying, if you don't take this, you're going to die. Now, talk about a dilemma. That means you're going to die if you take it, and you're going to die if you don't take it. Now, what do? Well, you could spend $500 or $1,000 a month and take it and die, or you could not spend that and die, if you did. But, there's always this fear and exaggeration, and mostly a lot of this operates out of fear. The thing is that there's just big money in all these things, and I could give you several examples of the things that have been going on for all this and how it's worked. So, now we want to talk just a little bit about what some of the causes are. Why do we have all the problems today? Well, we've always had problems, but not to the same level we've had today. And there's reasons for that, and it's so complex. Well, it is and it isn't complex. It takes a lot of time to get you to understand all the different reasons. But we were looking for causes, but ultimately they kind of gave up the causes because we don't care what the cause is. If you take this drug, it's going to lift your mood, or it's going to make you feel less anxious, or it's going to do this, or it's going to do that. But the problem is none of them work very well. Many of them are more placebo than any. I know one drug that came out on the market as a mood brightener, an antidepressant. They did the trials, and the final human trials, and so, of course, they're testing it against a placebo. Okay, so when they did the trial, the placebo was about 42% effective. That means 42% of the people who took the placebo got out of their depression with it. It improved. And 38% of the other drug that they were testing improved. So now we're saying, wait a minute, the placebo is 42% effective, the drug's 38%. Why don't we forget the drug and put out the placebo? And I told you about an acquaintance of mine a long time ago. Maybe I didn't. If I didn't, one of these days I'll repeat it for you again. But he put out a product called placebo. It said indication is nothing, active ingredients none. And people took it and felt better. And he didn't try to get them to buy it. They just saw it sitting there, placebo, and they bought it and took it. And they said, wow, I feel a whole lot better taking that. So at least 40% of them, I'm sure, did. So, because placebo effect is plus or minus about 40%. So, okay, here's a drug that's less than placebo. So they put the drug on the market, which had all kind of adverse effects. And one of the people in the study, I think I mentioned before, if I didn't, you should hear it, and if I did, then bear with it for a moment. But one of the people had been house-ridden, couldn't go out, was so depressed, couldn't function, phobic of everything. She got into the trial. Within 2 days of taking the pills they gave her, her depression lifted, she was out shopping, she was out doing everything, and she was feeling great, and she knew that she had gotten the drug, but unfortunately she had gotten the placebo. Or fortunately, because now it wasn't going to beat her up. So she saw that she didn't really need any drug, really. Her problem was her. And in most cases, we're going to find that that's the case, that is the real problem. So anyhow, always looking for causes. When DNA came along, there it is. It's all coded in the DNA. Everything that you have wrong with you, it's in the DNA. You can't help it. It's part of you. You bring it in. So if you have a depression gene, you're going to be depressed. If you have an anxiety gene, you're going to have anxiety. If you have this gene, you're going to have that. Well, you know, it all sounded real simple. A gene for this and a gene for that. And so they started the Genome Project, and you heard all these talk about, wow, boy, once we decode the genome of the human, we'll be able to splice in other genes, and we're going to be able to do genetic re-engineering, and we're going to solve everything just by, of course, it's going to cost you a little bit. You know, the test is going to be maybe $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000, but don't worry about that. And then, of course, the therapy would probably be another $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000, but don't worry about the insurance company's going to pay it. It doesn't cost anything. And of course, if you believe that delusion, you haven't been paying attention. Somebody's paying those premiums in because it's not coming from nowhere. And yet the insurance company just isn't donating the money to you. They have to collect it in premium before they can pay it out in benefits. And so people think that it's free, and nothing is free. Nothing is free in this world, not even advice. And if you do get some free advice, it's usually worthless anyhow. But apart from that, it just doesn't happen that way. Somebody is paying. Everything costs something. If you take it out of this pot, somebody had to have put it in the pot to take it out of. And that means if a whole lot of people are throwing money in the pot, and then others are taking it out in big chunks, everybody's not going to get the same amount. I know a cousin of mine many years ago when I was probably about 18, 19. I first started working. I was working as a chemist, and I ran into my cousin in the bank, and he was in line. And I said, well, how are you doing? He says, well, I found something to make a lot of money. You really should get into it. And I says, what's this? What do you have? He says, well, you see this list of names here? He says, the guy on the top, I'm buying 2 savings bonds I'm going to send to him. I'm going to buy it in his name and send to him. And then I add my name on the bottom of the list. And his name comes off when I send it to other people. And so it was this whole thing that if you get into it, he says, oh, you're going to make thousands and thousands of dollars just by buying 2 bonds. And I said, let's see, let me think. Okay, if you've got 500 or 1,000 people, and each one of those 500 or 1,000 people put in 2 bonds, that means if you end up with 4 bonds, somebody else ended up with none because there's only so many bonds and so many people. Now, how can that work? Oh, I don't know how it works, but I know it works. You can make a lot of money. So he bought his 2 bonds and sent off to the guy on the list, put his name on the bottom of the list, and sent letters to other people. And I ran into him a few months later, and I said, well, how did you do in that plan you got into? How much money did you make? He says, I never got any bonds. Well, somebody else ended up with 4 instead of 2 because they got your bonds. There is no free lunch. Somebody has to pay to make it work. The government doesn't give you anything. If you pay in $1,000, they might give you back $5 or $10, but they didn't give it to you, or they didn't give it to somebody else. Somebody paid it in and paid for it. So this whole idea thing that everything is free is not so. So anyhow, this whole DNA thing ended up, it's a wash because they figured they were going to find at least, well, we need 100,000 genes minimum to make all the different proteins we need in our body, and then we probably need another 25,000 regulator genes, so we're probably going to find about 125,000 genes in the Genome Project. And boy, they were all excited. They were getting down to the end. We're going to be able to get this all put together. They started to pool all the stuff that they had discovered, and lo and behold, there's only about 25,000 genes. Now, wow, if only 25,000 and we need 125,000, how does that work? I don't think there is a gene for this and a gene for that. Because pretty soon they were thinking there's a gene, obesity gene, there's a depression gene, there's an anxiety gene, and everything in the world was going to have a gene for it. But guess what? It's been kind of quiet. You don't hear all the talk about the Genome Project and the gene therapies like you did because it's not that simple. What they found is that maybe something triggers this gene, and that gene triggers these 3 genes, and those 3 genes trigger 5 other genes, and those are the ones that do the job. And how does it get from those? Who knows? We don't know. Maybe a little bit we'll be talking about epigenetics. In fact, we might as well do that now. So anyhow, it ended up, that wasn't working the way it was supposed to. We didn't have a gene for everything. So now we can't say, well, that you can't help it. You're depressed because you have a gene that makes you depressed. Well, that's not happening. So then what did come up is something called epigenetics. Epigenetics has to do with something in us, an informational imprint that we can inherit from somebody back along the way because of something that happened in their life, and it can be passed down through the family. And this something, this epigenetic factor, can actually affect the way genes are expressed. In other words, it could cause you to express good genes and hold back bad defective genes, or vice versa, depending on what the nature of the epigenetic is. Now, the closest thing to that, if you want to find out something maybe, is to read about miasms out of homeopathic medicine by Dr. Hahnemann, and that's going to give you a rough idea of what it's all about. So, the epigenetics tend to run in families, and if you read about the miasms discovered in the 1800s by Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, he discusses these miasms, which are an inherited taint. It could not be attributed to any particular structure per se. At least back then, they had no idea, other than the fact it was a reality, and when they treated homeopathically, they disappeared now. In other words, the people then didn't keep having the same problems over and over. Now, it's interesting because I've been doing homeopathic medicine for, probably 30 years at least, and maybe more. And so it's hard to believe, for example, that I had a lady call me. In fact, I was in a training program, and I got a call from her, and she said, I can't understand what's going on. I'm just feeling so depressed, and all I can think about is killing myself. And so I had access to some homeopathics where I was, and so I had it available that she could go pick it up. So she picked it up, and she called me probably 10 or 15 minutes after she had taken the dose I gave her. That was one dose of one remedy. And she said, I can't believe it. The depression's all gone, and I can't even hold the thought of killing myself in my mind. It was like that. And as far as I know, she never had any of this depressive stuff again. I'm only telling that to tell you that, if anything, it may be connected to epigenetics or miasms, but I know it responds to homeopathic therapy, so it's quite intriguing. So epigenetics you might want to look into. I think I've mentioned before a little bit about it, and there's a book out of it about it called The Genie and the Genes by Dr. Dawson Church, who's a PhD researcher. Met him a 3 years ago. There's now a second edition of it out in paperback. I got the original hardback edition, but I also have the new updated paperback edition. So you might want to get that material if you hadn't gotten it yet. It's in my book list. It's in the Amazon list I have on my website. You can click from there, go right to it, and get it. Very good. There's another new one out. I don't even have it on the list yet on epigenetics. That is very good. Also, goes more into detail. I mean, we're not just talking about some wishful thinking. We're talking about some pretty credible PhD researchers that are now realizing this whole concept of epigenetics. Funny, back in the early 1800s, Dr. Hahnemann, with none of the equipment, none of the sophisticated research tools, and so forth, did it by observing people and observing symptoms, and was able to put all this together. Now, we mentioned a little bit about the miasms when we did homeopathic medicine, but at some point we're probably going to go into it in more detail because it's a very important part to know a lot about. Now, I'm saying some of the things that have been going on related to why we have a lot of these problems. Well, one is epigenetics. Epigenetics is we bring it in with us familiar-wise, but not in the genes. But it can affect the way genes express, and there are some genes related to joy. There's parts of the brain related to joy, and that's what we want to get to. And there's going to be another broadcast, not necessarily just following this one, but about some of the tools, as I mentioned earlier, things you really want to know that can make a big, tremendous difference. Cause-wise, there's something called pre- and perinatal problems that causes us to have a lot of problems. Has to do with things that happen while the mother's carrying the child and during birth or right after birth. There's some therapies that developed. Janoff, or Janoff, depending on how you want to pronounce his name, in his primal therapy had to do with this birth trauma and how people reacted to that and how it left an imprint on them that they couldn't really put words to, because it was at a time when they didn't have conscious thought, they just had feelings. And so there's a whole organization of pre- and perinatal trauma, things that happen to people that later lead to problems in their life. And at some point we're going to do a whole broadcast just on pre- and perinatal influences, because the fetus starts hearing very early and starts being affected by things that are happening in the environment, things that are happening with the mother, and plus these epigenetics are work. I mean, there's a bunch of things going on. Then the trauma of birth, drugs given to the mother, you name it, all these things can have a big impact on the emotional mental health of a person that can be corrected, but you have to understand what's going on for that to happen. Now, we've talked about post-traumatic stress. There's one psychiatrist, Dr. McKenzie, I mentioned about him, or maybe I didn't recently. I think I did back a long way. His name is Clancy McKenzie. He's a psychiatrist, and he said pretty much all the adulthood problems like manic depressive, depression, tremendous anxiety, all these things, schizophrenia, go back to early life, first 3 years, and have to do either with birth order, and I don't have time to go into all the details about that, or have to do with the way it ultimately has to do with the way you responded to all of that. And so he is his material is very good, and so he calls it delayed post-traumatic stress syndrome, or disorder, or disease, or however you want to call it. And so he's had some very good success in doing that without drugs. So we're going to do one just on this whole thing of pre- and perinatal influences, whether it be nutritional or otherwise, all of it together, how it can have a big impact on us later in life. We also want to talk a little bit on, we've mentioned before, about mirror neurons we have. That's how the very early child mimics and learns. If he sees you or she sees you do something and watches you do it, inside your brain, these mirror neurons actually put your brain through the same processes that's going on in that brain of the person who's doing it. So we learn a lot of things by observing via these mirror neurons, and it's not something we have to give conscious thought to, it's done automatically. So that's the other new big field that's happening with the brain, are the mirror neurons, and you may want to look into, there's some books out that get into that more. I'm noticing more material coming out on it. So you might want to look at that if you want a better understanding. The diet deficiencies, I told you about the work earlier of Dr. Carl Pfeiffer in the Brain Biocenter in New Jersey years ago, and I think as far as I know it's still operating, and what they found that certain deficiencies could affect the way you behave and so forth, but those were correctable just by changing your diet and giving you a good diet and giving you a sufficient number of the elements. Remember we talked before about Dr. Roger Williams and the biochemical individuality, how we're all different. Some people are going to need more B6 than others, some are going to need more B2. So the thing is to get an adequate amount of those in your diet, and especially the B vitamins have a tremendous effect on the brain nervous system. So that's one of the big causes, and again, we don't have time to get in detail. One of the other big things I should mention is Dr. Russell Blaylock and et al., other doctors over in Mississippi, has been researching something called excitotoxins, such as NutraSweet and some of these factors, how they actually affect the neurology to the point that they can even damage it. But they overexcite, and remember what I said, when you overexcite by having too much of something in your brain, it can downregulate, and then you've got a bigger problem. And that's what happens for these excitotoxins. If you want to, you should read Dr. Blaylock's book called Excitotoxins. And he's been to the FDA, tried to get them to stop it, but the NutraSweet industry now is billions of dollars, and it's not going to happen, or at least anytime soon. It's not going to stop. So if you want to find out some of the stuff, that's one of the big problems that a lot of people have. And of course, eating too much sugar overstimulates the body. and that's not real great either. So we're talking, that goes back with the dietary and nutrient things. And on top of it, the standard granulated sugar strips nutrients out of your body like crazy, as well as to do a lot of the drugs. In fact, there's whole books on just what nutrients are pushed out of your body when you take certain drugs, and you have to, like the Lipitor, for example, and the other statins. They cause your body to lose CoQ10, which is an extremely important factor for your immune system, make energy in your body, and so forth. And so if you don't realize that, and you don't substitute by taking lots of it in your diet, you're going to be in big trouble. And I think those are the people who probably die when they just, the deficiency gets so great the body can't make energy anymore, this liver gets damaged, and kaput, the person's out. Life stress. We mentioned before about stress when we were talking about some of the big factors. That's important that we understand that and what it does. Too much stress beats us up by producing too much cortisol, which can inflame the arterial walls. If it's continually being dumped into the system, can deplete your adrenals, which is your ability to cope. And it also, when you're making too much cortisol, you're not making DHEA, which is extremely important for all kind of hormonal functions and for your body to regulate itself. And so the Heart Math Institute has found that if you can stop the stress, you can actually increase tenfold the amount of DHEA without even taking it as a supplement. You can increase it in your body by learning to regulate the heart, the second brain, which we've said some about, and we don't have a great amount of time now to get into. But by regulating the heart, the coherence of the heartbeat, getting rid of the microarrhythmias, you find that the cortisol goes down because the body relaxes, the adrenals settle down, and more DHEA is put out, which helps the body to function properly and in a more relaxed state. So those are some important things, and we're utilizing that principle in the weight program that we're talking about now. We want to get people to learn how to do that, and there is a way you can do that. You don't take any drugs to do it. Environmental toxins are really bad. Chemicals, toxic metals, it's gotten worse than ever. As the years have gone by, we're exposed to more and more of this stuff. Big, big problems. And so we really have to deal with that, and especially, again, we don't have time to get into all the details, but the importance of the pineal gland, which is in the very center of the brain, that's located right behind the hypothalamus, which is right below the thalamus, which regulates everything in the body. The pineal is responsible for making serotonin and melatonin, which helps you sleep properly. It sets up the sleep cycles and is very important with the circadian rhythms. But the mental, emotional, and also physical functioning issues have a lot to do with the pineal. And so guess what really messes up the pineal is fluorides. You know, like fluoridation, like in the water, like stannous fluoride, sodium fluoride, whatever those are, ones that they're putting in the water. They actually, I mentioned at one point the Nazis found out in the 30s of World War II, if you fed the people a lot of fluorides, they become very docile, they don't resist, they're not a problem, and they implemented it in the prison camps, and here we are pumping it in our water and putting it in everybody's body under the false premise it's going to stop decay. But if you understand how it really works, it's going to cause your body calcium metabolism to be screwed up, and it's going to make big deposits, hard deposits in the pineal that it won't function right, in your joints, and a lot of other problems like the arterial walls. You're going to have a problem with too much fluoride. The studies have been out there for a long time, but there was another case where you create a need because you got a product you want to peddle. The aluminum industry had too much sodium fluoride being left over from manufacturing aluminum. Because they had too much of that, the government said this is an extremely toxic substance. You've got to put it away in a place that it can't harm anybody. They had to put it in special drums with skull and crossbones, extremely toxic or poisonous, and pay a lot of money to dispose of it. They were getting tired of that, so they got a consultant that said, what can we do with this sodium fluoride so we don't have to spend a fortune to dispose of it? And so he picked up the papers and did a little research and found a little town in Texas where they had a little extra calcium fluoride in the water. Now, calcium fluoride is different than the fluorides they're peddling. Calcium fluoride in micro traces is helpful in the body, but only calcium fluoride, not sodium fluoride, not stannous fluoride, not all these other fluorides. So anyhow, He said, well, look, it looks like maybe they have fewer tooth cavities than the rest of the country. So therefore, maybe we can sell the public and the dentists and the government on the idea that putting a little fluoride in the water will save everybody a lot of cavities. Well, it didn't work, because look how the dental field is flourishing today. Are they better for taking the fluoride? Of course not. Same as taking all these drugs. Are we healthier? Yeah. Do we have better mental health? No. Getting worse. Bigger epidemic. So, I'm trying to provoke you to think. So, the fluoride can create tremendous problems in the body, make you very docile, make you not very clear in your thinking, and just all kinds of problems. There's a whole study done on that, but nobody ever hears about any of that. And I'm just telling you that the more I dig, the worse the problem gets. You cannot produce health by feeding people drugs to manage and manipulate symptoms in the body by shutting down or over-controlling the various circuits of the body. So, what I'm saying is, boy, we better, since we know what the big problems are, the stress, the environmental toxins, all this stuff. And of course the other one that we ought to consider too is the electromagnetics. That has a big effect also on the pineal. I'm not even going to get into all the functions of the pineal. It has tremendous implications. Historically, it has a tremendous history. And maybe at some point when you're better informed about a lot of things, maybe we'll get more into that. But at this point, just suffice it to say we need the pineal to work properly because it's sensitive to light, and it helps our body sleep properly and do a lot of things. And if it's messed up by too much fluorides, and guess what? A lot of the new general anesthetics are fluoride-based. Very toxic substance in the body. Always has been, always will be. It can shut down, block all kinds of things, including your thyroid, because it can kick out the iodine, or the iodine, which is the chemical name for what we call iodine. It can kick it out because it's part of a family of 4 substances called halogens: chlorine, fluorine, bromine, and iodine. The iodine is very important for us in a larger amount. We need a few molecules of chloride, we need a few molecules of fluoride in the bone and so forth, but very much messes up the whole bone. And then we need, I'm not sure that we need any bromine at all. Maybe we do if it's such a micro trace that you wouldn't want a lot of it. People are getting huge amounts because it's put in all kind of baked goods today. So we're getting brominized, which means we're being poisoned. And when you put those lighter halogens in the body, they push the iodine out and displace it, so we have defective thyroxine being generated. So we got another whole set of problems. Anyhow, I'm just coming down to the point that say we will be doing some other things for you. We're going to talk about the pre and perinatal problems. We're going to talk about some of the things you can do for yourself. We're going to be doing that down the road. And a lot of the self-help, an understanding of why they're good, and other understandings of way you can deal with all these issues without having to take the drugs. Anyhow, I hope you've enjoyed the broadcast. As usual, we've run over some. But we're going to be looking forward to seeing you back for the next broadcast. I'll see what kind of a provoking topic I can come up with. I'm really not trying to provoke you except to think. I want you to say, wait a minute, I don't want to be influenced by all this garbage advertising and so forth. I want to know something about what's really going on, and do I really need that? Do I need 25 drugs to live? Everybody doesn't. But if the drug companies had their way, you would. Everybody in the world would be taking 5 to 25 drugs their whole life. And of course, they would run the bill into trillions and trillions of dollars, but that's fine. They're making lots of money, and all it's costing is your health to do it. So you might want to consider all that. So please, I'm going to throw one more fast thing in. I know we're out of time. There's even questions about what really represents mental illness. Many years ago, a doctor by the name of Dr. Thomas Szasz, spelled S-Z-A-Z, put out a book called The Myth of Mental Illness, and then he put out some other books getting into the whole thing. He showed modern psychiatry to be very much like the Inquisition, with the insulin shock therapy, electroshock therapy, all these things that we're doing to people, the psychosurgery, and so forth. And anyhow, him and a lot of people in Europe, there was a whole group of people there that felt the same way, that when we are under a lot of stress and we have a crisis that we're dealing with, whether current or from our past, sometimes our choice is to just take a break for a while. We might call it a nervous breakdown, whatever it is. They said, it's a transition period, and if you drug the people, you're really going to make a mess. So, we've said enough. I hope you might want to look at Dr. Zass's material. And R.D. Laing was the other guy, Ronald D. Laing, that were leaders in this no such thing as mental illness, period. Maybe they're too extreme. I suppose there are cases when the brain can get damaged, and then you're talking a different story. When I say physically damaged, either from an accident or maybe from surgery, some type of trauma, maybe there's nothing left but some drugs. And I'm not saying there's never a time for them, but I'm just saying it's so grossly abused that we're creating more invalids than we're helping get out. And if you don't believe me, just look at the state of health in this country. Why is our bill up now into the $1 trillion range for what's called health, which is really sick treatment, if modern medicine is making us well and healthier? It's not. Pay attention to our future broadcasts. If you are just happening to see this, have not been to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, go there and register, not for us to bug you, but we'll send you notices of future broadcasts as what the subject's going to be. Go and read the website. You can click directly from there to this broadcast, as some of you know, maybe all of you by now. And you can also click for our other website called Alternative Health and Prevention that tells you something about the clinic here that I'm involved in. Anyhow, it was nice to be with you again. I'm looking forward to seeing you for another broadcast. Be healthy.